Hello, everyone. This is Preston Clark, the president of the Conduct and Culture Division here at EVERFI. Thanks so much for joining us for the webinar today, How to Build a Global Harassment Prevention Strategy. We'll get into introductions in just a moment. Before we get started, blocking and tackling, we will be recording the webinar. The recording will be sent out. Just give us a couple days on that. We'll send out the deck that we're presenting. I think that you'll find that the way we've structured this deck is pretty helpful. And so it's something that you can use internally as a framework and structure as you're planning and building your own. So we will send the PDF version of this out immediately following. I'm just making eyes with my team. I just want to make sure that the technical and audio is okay. So I'm just going to give me pause for 1 second, make sure we're coming through. Okay, so we got a couple pings that there may be an audio issue. So we're just going to do one more audio check just to make sure if folks can just type in audio okay into the chat box. We have a lot of folks signaling coming in from around the country and around the world on this. So certainly want to make sure. Yep. Okay. It looks like everyone can hear us. So we're gonna jump in now. So to frame the conversation, this is for many of you, this is a global conversation, and many of you represent and are leaders either in HR or compliance capacity or learning and development capacity for organizations that are in 15+ countries. So thematically today, a lot of what we're going to be talking about is how you think about a global initiative around harassment and discrimination prevention. But we also know that what has precipitated that in part, I know many of you wanted to get ahead of this and have been getting ahead of this for some time, but we know that in part has been driven by what we've just seen in New York, both at the city and the state level for bystander intervention and employee level, not just manager level training. And then what we're seeing in California, where our network is signaling, and what we expect to see happen likely in the next 2 weeks is either the passage of SB 1343 or SB 1300 that, similar to New York, would effectively bring down the harassment prevention training requirement to touch on all employees, not just supervisors. And so we know that for many of you, or maybe for some of you, there's a forcing function now where if you have a workforce in the U.S., in particular in those 2 states, where this is now going to be an obligation to train all employees, that it's time and for good reason to look at this through a larger lens of let's do this globally. Let's not just do this in the states that are mandating it. Let's do the right thing and let's take a global approach. And we know that easier said than done. Because there's a lot of complexity in doing that. It's also just worth noting that AB 1825 in California, and we're not talking about California today, we're not talking about US specific laws or regulations around harassment, but I want to paint and frame the picture because this affects us all. It affects the industry. It affects quite frankly, how I think the world and the country are going to perceive harassment prevention initiatives, whether domestic or global, is that if you think about what California started 15 or so years ago with harassment prevention through AB 1825, and then what we saw also in Connecticut and in Maine, it's worth noting that there was about 4 million people today that are impacted as supervisors that fall under that mandate. So there's 4 million employees, many of whom work for us in various offices and departments, that had to be trained, in this case, every other year. With the footprint expansion in California and New York reaching all employees, that is now expanding massively. And so this is just sort of a cool visual and important visual, I think, to realize that AB 1825 and the laws in Connecticut and Maine represent a 4 million person population, target population of learners, and now we have 30 million people who either are going to need to be trained annually or every other year in the United States, and that's a big deal. And so we know that there's a lot of chief compliance officers, CHROs, VPs of HR, CEOs who are rightfully so thinking about this more expansively. I had an opportunity to present at Compliance Week a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C., and we ran a survey out to the 500 or so folks, compliance leaders in that room, around whether or not they intended to deploy new harassment prevention initiatives in 2018. And the red bars in the numbers indicate percentage points of that room, and there's about 350 people who participated in this survey. And the two largest were that there was going to be an update in harassment policies, that there would be, or the three largest, there would be an expansion into global or company-wide harassment prevention training, and that there would be an incorporation of diversity and inclusion in the training initiatives. And so these weren't surprising to us, but I think we have hundreds of organizations registered for this webinar today, and that doesn't surprise us, because we know that for a lot of companies and a lot of organizations, 2018 represents a watershed moment in sort of the energy and momentum behind harassment and discrimination prevention and diversity and inclusion. We're going to do two polls during the session today, and I'm going to bring in my co-presenters Becca and George in here in just a minute. But I'd like to turn the controls back to Michele Kalu, just our webinar manager, for just a moment. We're going to share this back with the group, but I want to get a sense, for many of the companies that we're talking to now, there's just a lot of energy and potentially a board or C-level mandate to roll out a global training initiative or some sort of global harassment prevention initiative in 2018. And so I just want to we're just going to run a poll quickly to get a sense of timeline for all of you. I think that'll shape and influence a bit of the dialogue and conversation we're having today, because I think as we think about how you go about building an initiative, there's things that can be done quickly and there's things that take a long time. And so getting a sense of how urgent of an initiative this represents for your organization would be helpful. So Michele, if we can run the poll, we'll leave it open for just 60 seconds or so. Really, really appreciate everyone's participation in this. And in just a few minutes, we'll share this aggregated data back. Q3 2018, Q4 2018, Q1 19, Q2 19. Some of you may have no intention of rolling out globally, and that's fine too. You don't need to participate, but I know that for many of you, that you are planning on an urgent deployment, and as I'm seeing the numbers coming in, the majority of you are setting this for Q3. So time is of the essence. We'll share this full data survey back in about 15 minutes in the course of the webinar, but I really appreciate so many of you participating. We're going to leave the poll open for just one more minute, or about 30 more seconds. So I really, really would love everyone's participation on this. I think it'll be useful for you to know, as you're internally managing expectations, just to understand how many other organizations are thinking about a global deployment in 2018 versus 2019. Okay, Michele, we can go ahead and close that. So now we're going to jump into the meat of this. I already introduced myself. My name is Preston Clark. I run a big part of EVERFI's business, which is serving organizations in the U.S. and globally around both ethics and corporate compliance, from harassment and discrimination to code of conduct and anti-corruption and beyond. So I get to come in every day and work with a team here in San Francisco and in Washington, D.C. That leads big initiatives for global companies around these topics. Joining me as well is Becca Kolbaugh, who really is the subject matter expert on this topic. She spent the last 9+ months building out a new global harassment and prevention and discrimination program at EVERFI. And so a lot of the challenges and a lot of the anecdotes and just notes from the road and from the field will come from Becca on this webinar today. And I know how busy she is, because she has a lot going on as we're building a lot of new courses here at EVERFI right now. So very much appreciate her involvement and engagement today. Also joining me is George Homer. George, many of you may know George. He manages many of our strategic accounts, many of the largest global companies we work with. know and have worked with George. He's been in the compliance training space for over a decade. George, you believe that? It's been over a decade. And so he brings a lot of perspective and speaks with many of your peers on a daily basis and around harassment at the global level in particular in the last few months. And so wanted to bring him in and share some of the learnings that he's had as we've talked to many of your peers around how they're approaching global harassment. Okay, so the challenges or the framing of this webinar, and now we're going to dive into the meat of this now. So for the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to frame this entire conversation around 8 challenges. And there's a lot of complexity to rolling out a global initiative. And I know that for many of you, you may already roll out a code of conduct course centrally. There may be other initiatives that every single one of your employees at a global level experience, and that there's a central deployment. But I also know for many of you, global harassment may be the first central training initiative that you deploy, whether you're on, irrespective of which side of that fence you're on. I think you're going to take value from the conversation today, because I think that rolling out global harassment prevention centrally just has unique challenges to it that we've lived through. We want to share those learnings with you all, and I think Becca and George are uniquely positioned to do that. I also know that for many of you, you've done this before. You've rolled out a treating with people with respect, a course that has been deployed centrally in the past, but you may be thinking about upgrading it. You may be thinking about evolving it. And so some of these challenges, you'll probably nod your head and say, yep, we've lived through that before. But I still think that there's going to be some value for everyone involved. And I also think that given the current climate, I think that the Me Too movement, I think Me Too legislation, I think that the pressure that our workforce and our employees are putting on us as leaders to really elevate the bar in terms of how we educate our entire workforce on these topics means that we're all sort of taking a refreshed look at this. So I think that the 8 challenges that we're going to run through today are time well spent. We'll talk about training fatigue. We'll talk about the frequency that organizations are training, what a high frequency training experience means from a fatigue perspective, because maybe you're just planning on doing this once and every other 4 years, and so you're not as concerned about it. But for many organizations, they're trying to match what they're going to be doing in New York, and they know that there's an annual component to that. Thinking through what that looks like is a conversation we'll have today. We're going to talk about participation and tracking. Again, we know that for many of you, your distributed workforce, maybe they're on a retail sales floor somewhere, maybe they're on a manufacturing floor somewhere, maybe they have computer access, maybe they have cell phone access, maybe they don't even have email addresses. We know that participation and tracking of a global training initiative has its own complexity. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the notion of harassment prevention not being a legal course as it's been in California, but something that's about interpersonal relationships, it's about civility. So we'll dive into what that means. We'll also reconcile that with the reality that there's countries like Israel and India and others that have very strict policies around sexual harassment, and how you might reconcile those with your initiatives and how you might incorporate country-specific information in a centralized course that people in those individual countries can consume. And Becca has some really interesting and innovative perspectives on how your organization can do that at scale. We'll talk about versioning. Obviously, the goal is to have as few versions as possible, but we know that there are global considerations, there are country considerations, there are language considerations, and so figuring out the mapping of what it looks like. We've spoken to some companies that have made the decision that they're going to have maybe 3 or 4 different versions, where there's one version that gets deployed to all the countries that there isn't a sexual harassment policy that would impact or materially change the course, and then they'll have separate courses for each individual other country like India and Israel. That is a logistical decision. That's a business decision. There are cost considerations and update considerations for that. So we'll dive into that. And I think both Becca and George bring a lot of perspective in how that can be addressed. Talk about translations. If you have deployed centrally in the past, you know the ripple effect of translation and how hard that can be. So we'll talk about some of the tricks of the trade on that. That may be the piece that's most familiar to a lot of you, but I think it's worth a conversation because there's always shared learnings on how to do that better. We'll talk about localization. I'll hold on that because that's a really interesting one. We'll dive deep on that today. We'll talk about impact. I suspect that 80% of you are not thinking about this. I could be off on that. We should have done a poll on it at the beginning, but impact is really whether you want to call it efficacy, whether you want to call it just surveys and assessment data that measures the climate of the organization as it relates to harassment prevention, discrimination, diversity and inclusion, whatever it may be, but realizing that the level of scrutiny, the number of eyes at the board level and the C level that are on these types of initiatives, the mere fact that there's more companies that will do global harassment in 2018 and 19 than ever before means that the invariable question comes, which is it working? How is it going? Show me another data piece other than completion tracking. And so we're going to talk a little bit about ways to get data out of the training experience, out of the education experience, so that you're able to bring some summaries back to your executive board, to your C-level that give insights that can be helpful in future programs that you might run. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that without unduly exposing the business and pulling your general counsel's hair out in the process, because we certainly are not insinuating that you want to store a bunch of data that puts you at risk. But we also acknowledge that no data at all is not that informative in terms of how to address these challenges more foundationally. And then lastly, we'll talk about build versus buy. I think Becca has some great perspective on this, and really the purpose of build versus buy is just an analysis of whether you use a vendor like EVERFI or you build it yourself. There's cost considerations, and so we're going to actually focus more on the build of making the assumption that many of you will take this up on your own, but we'll talk through the complexities and who likely would need to be involved internally within your organization to get something like this through. And since I peeked at the poll data already, I know that many of you are planning a Q3 deployment. So it could be that you already have this figured out, or you may not, but we'll dive into those details. And our hope is to help you make your own internal business case to get the resources you need to pull something like this off. Quick analysis. We had about 350 folks register for the webinar. Many of you are just in one country. That surprised us a bit, but I think many of you, your perception of global may be you're in 47 states, and that represents its own complexity. So as I mentioned, I still think you'll get value from this webinar, but to be clear, this is very much a global facing webinar. The work that we've been spending the last 9 months doing is a ground up global build. It's not, retooling your California harassment training. And so I think that this is going to be most insightful to the folks on the left hand of the pie chart, but certainly would encourage the folks on the right to stay on as well, because I think there'll be some value as you're thinking about a distributed workforce in the US. Okay, so we're going to dive in now. Becca, George, we ready? Ready to go? Okay. So we're going to start with training fatigue, and I don't have a cool visual for this one as I do for some of the others, but just want to come out and just sort of ask the question. I'd like to start with you, Becca. How do you think about addressing, minimizing sort of the issue of training fatigue, understanding that for many of the folks on the phone, this may become an annual initiative? Would love to understand how you thought about that and maybe some things that you've built in or future goals at EVERFI to help address the very strong issue of training fatigue.
Sure. It's an important question, and one I think that we all think a lot about, and because we have to, because we know it's a very real thing. But taking a step back and thinking about not just training, because when you think about at the crux of training, it's really content that's being delivered to your employees. We are inundated with content every single day, more and more, whether it's coming from social media streams or news or on your phone or in your computer, what you're hearing on the radio, you're constantly inundated. So before you even think about how do you change the content, I think the first step is thinking about, how do you create content that's at this high fidelity level and that's going to cut through the amount of noise that we get on a daily basis when it comes to content. And to quote a good friend and mentor, it's not about creating more noise, it's about sounding different. So fundamentally, we've thought about this training to sound and look different. And immediately, I think that's going to be, a relief to employees and a welcome change to see something that's going to be like no other training that they've seen before. When you think about after someone's, kind of been delighted by the experience of the content when it comes to, high fidelity training material, it's interesting as we've been looking at this course in particular and working with global compliance experts and cultural experts, there's no shortage of scenarios and situationals that we've had to kind of grapple with and decide what makes it into the course. If we wanted to include all of them, it would be like a 4-hour course, which we know is not practical. So when we're thinking about how do we, add interesting updates to the training, I think we're going to be focused on, what are the case studies and the situationals and the scenarios that we're going to present to the learners? How do we put different themes and topics within those scenarios? And then we also think about features from our product set. What are other features that are going to be coming into the training and coming from the platform and the product side that's going to make for a more interesting and engaging experience for the learner?
So to dive into that just for a second, Becca, so is then the idea that let's say the decision is annual, and I know some of you may not be, but let's assume for a second that the decision is annual, that through the development of your course, you saw enough other alternate scenarios that there would be an opportunity to alternate so you could have a similar learning objective but could manifest in a different way. So for a learner who went through it the year before, there's still some reinforcement of core values, but it's just manifesting in something that is different from what they would have seen before?
Absolutely. We want to stick true to the core training pillars and the learning objectives, but there's so many different ways that you can do that, whether it's the actual details of a scenario or it's the medium that you're presenting that scenario through. So whether it was an interactive exercise versus now a motion graphic or a branching interactive video, there's lots of ways that we can change that for the learner to give them a new and interesting experience.
That's great. And George, I know that you were recently at Compliance Week and you sat in on a pretty interesting session with GM and Walmart, I think, and there was a perspective on this for those two large multinationals that I'd love to get your take on.
Great, thanks, Preston. And so certainly depends on the company and how often they're looking at training, but most of the companies that I'm talking with are looking at doing this on an annual basis, but they're also thinking about, do I build this from the ground up? Do I use an off-the-shelf solution? And so certainly not everyone is ready with their particular solution, but meeting with the Compliance Week folks and Kurt Drake put on a session, and Kurt's the CCO at Kimberly-Clark, who is a partner of ours, to really focus on online compliance training. And in that session, GM and Walmart, their compliance folks were presenting, and essentially the theme of that presentation was, we never show the same course twice. And so what we're doing is refreshing scenarios. We might change up the look and feel, but we're not putting the same thing in front of our employees annually as they've seen before.
Yeah, that's great. And I know that with that becomes, there's an added complexity, because we're going to spend the next few minutes walking through other facets of building a global program, and the notion of having to relive this pain on an annual basis is not fun. So to keep in mind, I think some of what Becca is going to share are sort of foundational design elements that allow you all to create adaptability and refresh content faster, because I do think that the goal here is not to need to hire 4 people internally to handle this new initiative. There has to be a way of efficiency to do this right, but understanding that we don't want to be having this conversation 5 years from now, where your employees have sat through the same course every year in that period. So let's talk for a minute about participation and tracking. And again, I know that for many of you, you already have a global initiative, but George, I know that in your conversations, even with, like, I think you and I have been surprised a bit. So I think even for large multinationals that have already and consistently deployed training initiatives that touch every employee, it's not necessarily a central deployment. They may have regional versions. They may have regional offices and compliance heads that are deploying or doing something in person. But for many organizations, they're talking and thinking about making this a central initiative, which makes participation and tracking its own animal. And so would love for you don't necessarily need to talk through all of the components on the screen here, but maybe a few of the highlights that you think are important.
Absolutely, Preston. And so when we think about an initiative like Code of Conduct, where global harassment prevention is now very similar, on par with that, we think about the tools and technology to actually reach a tremendously dispersed audience. And so thinking about considerations for the LMS integration to where you're able to scale this and deploy to your audience across different countries is critical, and really thinking about the logistics and the technologies to actually put that in place, which brings me into the HRIS integration. And so when we're thinking about country-specific locations with different roles, different departments, different locations, to get that,
different languages,
it's just a complex initiative, to say the least. And so getting that pulled across the entire network, if you will, is critical to have the ability to integrate in with these systems. And I've talked with many companies that have 4 or 5 brands with different LMSs and different HRS systems. So it's just critical to have everything buttoned up from an IT perspective. Another piece that we're talking a lot about is mobile responsive. And so, as Preston had mentioned, many of these employees in other countries don't have email addresses, or they don't have access to the internet. And if they do, maybe the bandwidth isn't very good. And so being able to access the program on a mobile device is now more important than ever. And lastly, thinking about the communication strategy. And so this is critical when we think about getting the message out to the dispersed workforce in locations across the globe, whether that's an auto email reminder to help increase participation and get this initiative done, whether it's the message from the CEO and how important this topic is and how seriously our organization takes this. And so really how you're positioning this on a global scale is critical. And so having that communication strategy in place is just so important.
Yeah, that's great, George. And we just know that for many of you, if the goal is 80%, 90%, or even 100%, that this may be something that's keeping you up at night, because it's certainly hard, especially for that last 10%, to chase those folks down. And when you compound that with a global initiative and a distributed workforce, it gets even harder. Want to talk for a couple minutes now about country-specific mandates. And we know that there are countries like Israel and India that have very strict policies around harassment prevention. They may have publication requirements. Here's a quick just overview around what those are in the case of Israel and India. And here we have, in the case of Israel, you have to publish a set of rules for the prevention of sexual harassment in the workplace. That may not be something you decide to incorporate into your training. It may be something you incorporate into your training, but certainly, even though the development of a global harassment course is not a legal exercise, as AB 1825 is, it doesn't exclude the fact, and we can't be blind to the fact, that there are country-specific requirements that we at least need to reconcile, consider, understand, and potentially incorporate in. And now the question is, how do we do that without materially altering what should be something that's value-based, which we'll talk about in a little bit, because this is not a legal course. So that's sort of its own complexity, and we'll talk more about that. But I just wanted to bring up that country-specific is real, and it's important, and it's worth thinking about, it's worth tracking, but it certainly adds a layer of complexity as you're thinking about your global initiative. Becca, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that before we move on to the next one?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think that traditionally anti-harassment training has really relied almost solely on laws and policies. And not only do we recognize the complexity that comes into that when you're dealing with so many potential countries, or your company's growing very quickly and you could add X amount of countries every single year and you've got to keep up with that. We also believe fundamentally that in order to really have impact-based training and to think about preventative strategies, we want to go above and beyond the law.
Yeah.
So it's important from a core training material that we're thinking more about the values and principles, which we'll get into, but there's always ways that you can layer in these country-specific and legal mandates that are only going to enhance and highlight what we know to be true for the core training material.
That's great. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about versioning, and this is a place where it gets exciting for us because it was so hard for us to figure this out a year or so ago when we first started just sort of mapping out this, when it was a twinkle in our eye. The notion of not just countries but languages, the reconciliation. George talked a little bit about HRIS tracking, but the realization that someone in France may not speak French. They may not be a French citizen, but they may be located there, and that they need a certain course that both reconciles whatever version you may have for France, but a different language. There's layers of complexity to what this becomes for large multinationals that we understand. And Becca would love, I think this is the piece, as I've watched you and your large team build out this initiative for the last several months, this is maybe the piece that I've been most fascinated in watching, and so would love you to just sort of walk us through how you thought about it and recommendations you have for global organizations thinking about it.
For sure. It's no easy problem, and I don't know if we have the best solution, but I think that of all of the minds that came together, we feel really confident about how we're approaching this. So kind of piggybacking on what I mentioned before, our core training material is really focused on what is morally right, what is respectful, what is equitable for all, not just what is legally right. And by approaching the core content in this way, we can address what is expected of all employees. Because as we also heard from the market, many employers don't want to only rely on the bare minimum of what a country's law requires. They want all employees to be held to a singular standard. So we believe that, by creating the bedrock of the content so focused around these values and these principles, respect, equity, acceptance, that we can meet all the needs of different learners across countries. Now, when we've got to drill down to get into more specifics, whether a customer does want to create this training to be specifically compliant, or whether there are particular resources or policies that are going to relate to individual learners by country, we've thought about containing all of this content within what we consider a hallmark feature of the course, which is going to be our interactive map. This is a natural way for people to understand, how content is divided up by geography. So what we're going to do is allow customers to be able to insert whatever information they want to for their learners in different countries. And what's really important about this is that it's also a very scalable way to add new laws that might come into effect in a country, to add more details, or to change the helpline or the contact information for that particular country, which we know can be important for some training mandates and some legal mandates in different countries. So this is our way of keeping this adaptability open and alive, but also providing this really highly interactive and engaging experience for the learner, right? Typically just going to like a resources menu is not that exciting. We want to make it exciting because we know it's really important and we know this is a high need in the market.
That's awesome, Becca. I think that this also is a point of differentiation for a code of conduct initiative where I think you may, from a global perspective, you may know that regions of the world represent disproportionate risk around bribery, corruption, whatever it may be. And so you may decide to reinforce training, but you wouldn't necessarily, you're not looking at 18 different versions, or you're not looking at a lot of country-specific information. Perhaps you are, but from the work we've done, we think that this is more critical of a tool or a sort of design construct for harassment prevention than it would be for other types of training. So I think that we had to put a lot of thought and energy into this because we just saw it as a necessity.
Right, and just thinking from a logistics standpoint, you know, for the ability to only administer one single course for all learners frees up so much time for the administrator to focus on other really critical areas. But we know that this can be a logistical challenge, so we're hoping that this solves that problem.
Awesome. So we're going to talk about translations for just a second. I wanted to, we're having a couple questions come in that I just want to address, so I'm just going to go off script here for just a minute. We're coming into this with an assumption that many of your organizations, if not all of your organizations, have made the decision that harassment and discrimination prevention is a strategic imperative and is something that has to be done. But I want to pull back off that just for a second and say that for those of you who are sort of on the fence about this, maybe you own whether this happens or not within your organization, I think it's just worth noting that EVERFI's pedigree and DNA in this is that we just happen to be the largest provider of sexual misconduct prevention in the world. We do it for hundreds and hundreds of global companies. We do it for almost 2,000 colleges and universities. So before, for those of you with children in the US, before they step foot on a college campus, they'll go through a program powered by EVERFI for sexual violence prevention. And so I bring it up because a lot of our DNA is around educational initiatives and programs that are focused on prevention and efficacy in prevention. And I know that foundationally, when you're talking about interpersonal relationships, and then you compound that on a global scale. I've spent many years of my life living outside the country. Not every country is the same. Not every value system is the same. This is a really hard mountain to climb, and I get that, and I appreciate that. And I think that the perspective that we're taking, and I think that the perspective and strategy that many of you taking are, we have to find the best way to do our best work, because not addressing these issues globally is not an option anymore. And so I realize that many of the things that cripple our organization around discrimination, around diversity, start and are precipitated by things that happened when we were 4 years old and we were 10 years old, and where we're from and where we're born and who our parents are. And there's so many multicultural complex circumstances that go in, but we live in a multicultural environment. So the assumption is for many of you that we have to do better, and we have to start conveying our value system as an organization, what our values are, what we believe in, how we believe the right ways to treat each other, and we know that that's an important initiative. So I just want to take it sort of on face value that most of the folks on the webinar understand that as hard as this is, that it's critical that we get better at it, and that's why EVERFI is so excited about building this initiative, and I hope you all are as well. Okay, so let's talk about translations. This is our interpretation of what we call the translation equation. I'm sure for those of you who have led code of conduct initiatives, you know what this means. This is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but the idea is that when you're talking about a central course that is scripted and authored around standard scenarios, that the notion of translation is not as simple as translating words on a page and being done. There's a ripple effect that occurs as you modify and update the course that has massive cost considerations, massive logistical considerations. And so we just know that this is hard. And so I want to turn this to Becca for a minute to get your perspective on some of the challenges that we've seen and lived through, and some of the learnings you've taken from that.
For sure. I think the biggest thing with when you're translating is when you start to change the content, you know, on a particular page or within or throughout or integrated throughout a module. What we found through our linguistics QA and working with our language experts is that the in-context review reveals that fundamentally, you know, one word can change the meaning of a sentence in any given language. And for some languages, that's more likely than others. But we have to think really holistically about, you know, the learners in these native languages, how they're going to be interpreting the content. So we want to make sure that the intent carries through. And the more you can think about making changes in chunks of content rather than pieces of content, we're less likely to kind of get out of this, beautiful mind scenario that we're looking at here on the screen.
Got it. So in other words, as we think about English-only courses, we can be very iterative and say, hey, you know what? Like halfway through, the CEO says, I don't like this word on page 37 or this narration on minute 32, and that's something that you can sort of surgically go in and change, but that at the global level, when you're trying to maintain a central narrative and central script, one-off changes end up having a ripple effect. And so it's, if I can sort of restate what you just said, and I may have gotten it wrong, is that just has to be done more strategically. Like it's harder to make the one-off change with a global initiative.
Right. Just mostly because the context can change so quickly. And then as we get into, the approach that EVERFI has taken for the cultural localization, that becomes an even more critical factor to consider.
Got it. Okay. Super helpful. Okay, so let's talk now about localization. I think that I'll just tee up this first slide, and then I think this is, Becca, again, where your expertise comes in. But we've talked a little bit already about this not being a legal course. We know that to be true. What that means, though, is that we're focusing, as many of you are already, on conveyance of values and ethical drivers, from civility to allyship to respect to commonality, that there are themes and narratives that will be woven through your training that will be very different from a legal focused course on, what's acceptable from a corruption, like what crosses into corruption or what doesn't. It's not as black and white. It's more interpersonal than that. And with that comes its own complexity. And I think, I don't know if every organization is going to take this approach, Becca, but I was fascinated with what your team took into this around cultural localization, and would love for you to walk through power dynamic themes, the collectivist individualistic themes, and sort of how you've thought about localization on this topic.
For sure. So, it took us a while to get here, and it took, again, a lot of minds to come to the table to really think about this. But, focusing again on those values-based and the principle-based, getting away from just the bare minimum of the law, got us thinking about, well, the way that respect is shown and perceived actually changes from country to country. So tailoring the content based on cultural norms and values, we believe creates a more relevant, realistic, and impactful learning experience by not just acknowledging, but really truly supporting a diverse global audience. So similar to the fact that we're going above and beyond the law with this principle-based approach, we're going above and beyond traditional localizations, like saying office mate versus coworker, or lift versus elevator. Those are kind of more traditional localizations. We're going above and beyond just translating words and just thinking about localization. So ultimately, to keep this as simple and scalable and manageable as possible, we considered two cultural dimensions. And depending on the learner's self-selected localization, the course will emphasize and the content will strike upon either the responsibility of each person in individualistic cultures or each workplace community in collectivist cultures. We're also taking into consideration the differences in power dynamics that may exist across cultures. And just to unpack that a little bit, in some cultures, existing power dynamics and perceptions are that, abuse by superiors is not only expected, but it's also accepted. So we want to think about the way that we position our training material for those learners in particular by using or not using certain phrases like abusive power. It might not resonate the same way it will for other cultures. We also want to stress the role of a manager being a benevolent and a trusted leader who's responsible for looking out for those with less authority and power. That's just one example to kind of unpack the power dynamics aspect. But circling back to this notion of impact, by taking in these types of cultural considerations, we believe that we can put learners more at ease and more comfortable when it comes to taking critical actions, such as making reports where there are instances of harassment or discrimination. And we also go into suggesting the appropriate prevention and intervention strategies that's going to resonate with those cultures and dynamics.
Becca, this is, I think, of the work that you've done and your team has done, this is perhaps the most fascinating. We've gotten a lot of great feedback from CCOs and CHROs in terms of this approach, which has been great. I think that for many of you, you may be sitting back in your chair with your brain about to explode in terms of what this represents, because there's a trickle-down effect from translations, et cetera. There's a great document, Becca, that there's an executive summary that explains the notion of cultural localization. And I would say whether you're going to partner with an existing organization you work with to build your global course, you're going to build it on your own, whatever it may be, we have an awesome executive summary. If you would like it, if you just sort of put in the chat box executive summary, there's literally a one-pager that encapsulates this philosophy and this approach. And if you'd be interested in having it, just signal to me in the question box that you'd like it. Just put executive summary or whatever, so we can send it to you afterwards. But I do think that this is some good learning.
And to be clear, we've been working very closely for 9 months with cultural and compliance experts to get to this level. So that's just the best that we can do to kind of boil down that ultimate strategy. But it's a lot to wrap your head around for sure.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, we're running low on time, so we're going to breeze through the last few minutes here, but I think the last couple pieces are important. So as I mentioned in the outset, one of the things that we've found is that there's just increased scrutiny around harassment and discrimination initiatives, and so it's not enough to just say we've now deployed something globally. For many of you, there's going to be the need to have a data feedback loop that shows where the organization stands on these issues, and some of that relates to knowledge gain. Does your workforce know where to report an incident of X? Do they know what constitutes a breach of Y? All the way to attitudes and behaviors. Would they feel comfortable reporting an incident of X to their supervisor or manager? And so we've thought about this a lot, and whether you decide to do this at all, whether you decide to do this as a part of your annual employee engagement survey, or what we do at EVERFI, where you actually incorporate it into the training initiative, because we know employee engagement surveys and participation numbers are hard to achieve already. But in one way, shape, or form, we know that many of you are going to want to report back around knowledge gain and attitudes and behaviors around harassment and discrimination. Up there is just a sample of 4 questions. This is something, again, we have a whole research team in Boston led by Rob Yulo and Holly Ryder-Milkovich, who are prevention experts, who craft the instruments around these survey questions. We have more. We can just send them to you if you're interested in potentially incorporating these into your existing programs. Happy just to send some sample surveys to you to think about. But we see this as a mechanism to get live feedback, to look at longitudinal data patterns over time. So I'm happy to share that. Similar, again, sorry to make this a little bit tedious, but if you're interested in sample climate survey type questions, just type that into the question box so I know who you are, and we'll get those out to you. And then I mentioned, but the ability ultimately to roll that up into a data story. Data visualization matters. The board likes it. CEO wants to see it. We can also help you offline in terms of how you aggregate that data and how you interpret that data, and ultimately how that data becomes actionable, because I think a lot of those questions can reveal actionable steps and strategies that our folks in Boston are honed in on and can advise you on. So to wrap, I think that the build versus buy is an important analysis to think about. This is not sort of a scare tactic. We know that you all are in senior positions. You knew a lot of the complexity going into this. We hope that this webinar has helped shape that, inform that a bit more. We'll certainly send out this deck. But when we think about the build side, for you all who are going to own this internally, you may have owned code of conduct initiatives, you may have owned other large global initiatives where you've already dealt with your translation services company, you already have global compliance SMEs, but maybe you don't have a harassment prevention SME, maybe you don't have anyone managing data analytics, maybe you're a CCO and you've never really had to cross the aisle, if you will, and work with human resources, who now has historically been the owner of your California program, but now you need to pull it in to central compliance because it has a global component. So happy to provide any additional support, even, like it's our job to help you deploy these programs, whether you do it with us or you do it on your own. We're happy to help give you guidance in a build scenario, because we know that, again, whether you build this or buy this, there's going to be serious resource allocation to do so. And we know that for many of you wanting to deploy this just in the next few months, that this is a lot of pieces to pull together in a very short period of time. I'm going to pause here. I know we're running low on time, but I promised that I'd flash the survey results back up. So, Michaela, if we could just pause for a minute. If you all remember, about 40 minutes ago, we took a survey around when you all planned on deploying a global initiative. So 37% said not sure, all good, understandable. The largest percentage, though, is Q3. Check my watch here. Q3 is 3 days or 4 days from now, so we know that that's coming right up. And so that's fascinating, and we'd love to understand and learn from all of you, and because presumably this is something you've been working on for the last X number of months. Maybe it's an initiative you already had in place, but currently revamped. But very interesting. And then I think the rest of you all are looking, as the math plays out, 45% of you will deploy in 2018, which is great. And then the rest of you will be rolling out from there on. So very interesting, Kaylee. Thanks for flashing that up. So just in the last few minutes here, I'd be remiss not to mention the great work that Becca and over 25 team members here at EVERFI, from the researchers in Boston to our engineers in Washington, D.C., to our legal writers here in California in our San Francisco office. They've spent a lot of time building out a global harassment and discrimination training program, and we're really proud of it. We're really excited about it. Again, I know that many of you may already have something in place. You may already have this box checked, but to the extent that we can help you, we will be launching this in September, and we'll have demos available starting next week. So if you're interested, if you'd like to learn more, we're going to flash one more poll up. Again, no hard sell here, so we hope this has been informative, irrespective of whether or not you do any work with EVERFI in the future. But certainly, I'm very proud, as Becca is, of the program that we built here at EVERFI, and we know that many of you who have a short cycle turnaround for Q3 or Q4 may need some help, and we'd certainly love to do that. And at the very least, a demo might give you some information that can help shape your own course. So happy to make that available. If you just go ahead and type in, the second one says yes with 2018 launch goal. That's informative for us because certainly there's a bit more urgency. We expect that we're going to do about 20 global launches in Q3 with quite frankly, and we're very proud of it, some of the largest global companies in the world, some of the largest Fortune 100 companies in the world. So a lot of pride and excitement around that. But if you have that level of urgency, we would certainly love to get in front of that now to figure out if there's a fit. And if there's not, that's okay too. But again, we want to be helpful. Michaela, I think we can pull back out of this. Thanks everyone for participating in that. So that's it. We had a number of questions that came in. I want to be respectful of time. We will send out the recording. We will send out the slides. We will send out the executive summary. Again, a quick reminder, if you'd like an executive summary of the cultural localization that Becca walked through, just type that into the chat box. I think that one question that I do want to get, some of these I just need to answer specifically. I'm not sure they're group answer questions, but one of them came in that I wanted to ask you, Becca, just in the last couple of minutes is I'm trying to word this right, but it has to do with, it says, what video or other formatting style do you recommend for global?
Sure.
And I think I think you know what that means. So
yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you know, we had to keep in mind the fact that we're working with a very diverse and global audience. So we intentionally steered clear of photography and other asset types that can often isolate one country or one type of people. So we really focused on motion graphics, narration, illustrations, and bringing those all into interactive tools like quizzes and situationals.
That's great. And I think that what I've seen too is that like we've done some amazing video production work for large companies,
right.
Google and others. And when you go on site and you film an amazing experience, that's probably going to be representative of one office, of one experience, and that's going to be hard to translate across a global audience, as powerful as video can be.
For sure. Live action video is not, you know, a recommended, you know, format from our perspective. If you did it, it would be so costly to do it right and to be really authentic for every single country that you have learners in.
I think one other theme that's come up, and I just want to touch on briefly before we close here, is that I don't think, I know I'm being too kind here, you can't restructure your AB 1825 course and go global with it. I think that so many of the core elements of from the case studies, to the types of the scenarios, to the characters you would have used, to the names of those characters, you have a US-centric course at the core, and there are defects to that foundationally that will not create a culturally sensitive global course. And so I just think a big learning for us, because we've been doing AB 1825 for 10 years plus. It's a course that we do. We're one of the largest providers in the world for that. We knew that we had to start from scratch and that there couldn't be remnants of a California course in this. Beck, I don't know if you have any perspective on that, but that's just been a strong, resounding signal that I've seen from your work.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And you know, again, in U.S. trainings, there are similar common threads of those core pillars: respect, acceptance, equity. But it's all about how we position those principles and those values, and how we stitch that together into a larger story and a larger training around global harassment.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Thanks for everyone who participated today, for you participated in the polls. We got a lot of follow-up questions and requests for executive summaries and so on. That we'll be coming back with. Becca, thank you. I know how busy you are. George, thank you. I know how busy you are. Really appreciate you joining us. Michele, thanks for running the webinar, as you always do. We'll be having more of these webinars. We'll be doing a full launch of the course in September and a live streaming webinar at that time for the world as well. Feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions. My email is Preston, Preston @everfi.com. Happy to answer those directly. That's it. Thank you so much.